One of the biggest misconceptions people have about avoidant personalities is that they simply don't care. That when they walk away, they're detached, unbothered, free. But that's not the truth. What's really happening beneath the surface is far more complex, and honestly, far more human. Avoidants don't withdraw because love means nothing to them. They withdraw because love feels dangerous, because closeness triggers something deep inside them, a sense that they're about to lose control. For an avoidant, intimacy is a paradox. It's something they crave but can't fully tolerate. The moment connection begins to feel emotionally consuming, their instinct is to retreat. Not because they want to hurt you, but because in their mind, distance equals safety. It's how they maintain a sense of identity, autonomy, and emotional control. You see, for them, love doesn't feel like expansion. It feels like surrender. And surrender has always been linked to pain. So, when they pull away, it's not indifference. It's self-protection disguised as detachment. Most avoidants grew up in environments where emotional closeness was inconsistent or overwhelming. Maybe affection came with conditions. Maybe vulnerability was punished or ignored. Over time, they learned a subtle but powerful lesson. If I depend on someone, I lose myself. So as adults, when intimacy deepens, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as love, it interprets it as risk. Their mind goes into survival mode, convincing them they need space to breathe, time to think, or distance to find themselves. But the truth is, they're not trying to find themselves, they're trying to preserve themselves. And that's where the illusion begins. The illusion that leaving gives them freedom. At first, it does feel liberating. The tension fades, the pressure lifts, and their thoughts quiet down. But that's temporary, because freedom that's born from avoidance isn't freedom at all. It's relief. And relief eventually wears off. What comes after is the echo of everything they've tried to suppress. The mind might rationalize distance, but the body remembers connection. The emotional bond doesn't disappear just because they've stepped away. This is why, time and time again, avoidants circle back. They run because connection overwhelms them, but once they're alone, the silence starts to turn on them. It magnifies what they were trying not to feel. The absence that was supposed to bring peace starts to feel like loss. The space that was meant to protect them starts to feel like isolation. And the illusion of control begins to crack under the weight of loneliness. Because what avoidants are really running from isn't the person they love. It's the vulnerability that love demands. Now, here's the irony. The more they avoid, the less in control they actually become. Emotional avoidance creates dependency in disguise. When they pull away, they start to rely on distance to feel safe. But distance can't meet emotional needs. It can only numb them. So eventually, the system that was built to protect them starts working against them. The heart begins to crave what the mind rejected. And that craving becomes magnetic. They begin to remember the calm in your voice, the comfort in your presence, the way connection once felt before fear took over. Avoidants come back not because they suddenly understand everything, but because they begin to realize that escape doesn't heal attachment. It only delays it. You can't outrun the parts of yourself that need love. You can only meet them, understand them, and slowly learn how to exist with them without running away. For avoidance, this return is often quiet, cautious, hesitant. But it's real. It's not always about reconciliation with a person, but often reconciliation with themselves. And that's what makes this pattern so powerful to understand. Because it's not about blame. It's about awareness. The avoidance cycle isn't driven by a lack of care. It's driven by fear disguised as independence. And once you see that clearly, you stop taking their distance personally. You start recognizing that what feels like rejection is often just emotional survival. But awareness goes both ways. For those who love avoidance, understanding this dynamic means you stop chasing. You start allowing space to teach them what distance can't. That safety isn't found in running, it's found in connection that doesn't threaten identity. And for the avoidant, the lesson is equally profound. Freedom isn't the absence of closeness, it's the ability to stay open in the presence of it. Because ultimately, every avoidant journey leads back to one truth. No matter how far they run, the heart always knows where home is. You know, one of the most misunderstood things about avoidant people is the way they handle emotion. From the outside, they look calm, composed, almost unaffected. They can end a relationship and seem fine the next day, as if it never touched them. But that's not calm. That's suppression. That's what it looks like when someone has learned to intellectualize every feeling instead of experiencing it. They don't process emotion, they manage it, but like a problem that needs to be solved, not a wound that needs to be felt. Avoidants are thinkers first, feelers second, not because they were born that way, but because it's how they survived emotionally. Many of them grew up in homes where emotional expression wasn't safe or productive. Maybe they were told to stop crying. Maybe their vulnerability was met with criticism or withdrawal. So over time, they learned to shut it down. They built an internal rulebook that said, feeling too much means losing control. Losing control means getting hurt, and that belief still runs the show in their adult relationships. So when a breakup happens or an emotional conflict surfaces, they default to suppression. They analyze instead of grieve. They distract instead of process. They convince themselves that if they can understand what happened, they don't have to feel what happened. And that's why you see avoidants move on so quickly, or at least appear to. They're not actually moving on. They're moving around the pain. They compartmentalize it, lock it up somewhere deep, and tell themselves, I'm fine. But here's the truth. No one gets to skip grief. You can delay it, you can disguise it, but you can't avoid it forever. The emotions you refuse to process don't disappear. They wait. They wait in your body, in your subconscious, in the quiet moments when there's no distraction left. And that's when avoidants begin to feel the emotional echo of what they ran from. It might take weeks or months, sometimes even years, but eventually the numbness fades and the reality of what they've lost starts to sink in. You see, emotional suppression is like pressing pause on a movie and expecting the story to end. It doesn't end. It just waits. And when you press play again, everything that was unresolved comes flooding back. That's what happens to avoidants. They don't come back because they suddenly realize they made a mistake in logic. They come back because their emotions finally catch up to their intellect. But the heart always lags behind the mind, but it never stays silent. This is why time doesn't always heal avoidance the way they expect it to. Healing requires engagement, emotional engagement. It requires the willingness to sit in discomfort, to feel the loss, to confront the regret. But avoidants mistake avoidance for strength. They believe that not feeling pain means they've mastered it. What they don't realize is that unprocessed emotions quietly shape their behavior, influencing every future relationship. They repeat the same patterns because they've never fully closed the emotional loop from the last one. And when that emotional backlog becomes too heavy, the subconscious starts to crave resolution. That's when they begin thinking about the person they left behind, not just out of longing, but out of unfinished emotion. It's like a chapter that wasn't written properly, a story that doesn't have an ending. The human psyche can't stand open loops. So they circle back, seeking not necessarily to rekindle, but to reconcile with themselves, with their emotions, with what they couldn't face before. If you've ever had an avoidant come back into your life after months of silence, it's often because that emotional suppression finally cracked. Maybe a song triggered a memory. Maybe a quiet evening left too much space to think. Whatever it was, it woke something up that logic couldn't suppress anymore. And that's when they realize that running from emotion doesn't protect them, it imprisons them. But there's a deeper lesson here for both sides. For the avoidant, true strength isn't in control, it's in courage. The courage to feel what you've spent years avoiding. The courage to face the fear of dependence, the grief of loss, the truth of vulnerability. For the person who loves an avoidant, understanding this helps you see that their silence isn't always rejection, it's defense. It's their nervous system trying to regulate in the only way it knows how. Suppression is a temporary strategy, but resolution is the real healing. Because when emotions are finally allowed to move through, they stop haunting you. They stop controlling your behavior. And that's when genuine connection with yourself and others becomes possible again. Avoidants always come back, not because they miss the comfort of the relationship, but because emotional suppression eventually collapses under its own weight. You can't run from what lives inside you. Sooner or later, you have to meet it. The emotions we avoid don't disappear. They wait for us to return and finish the story we were too afraid to feel. One of the most fascinating things about avoidant behavior is the way they keep circling back to what feels familiar. Even after they've spent so much energy trying to escape it. It's paradoxical, isn't it? They run from closeness, yet somehow end up craving the very thing they tried to leave behind. They withdraw because connection feels suffocating, but when the silence stretches too long, the same connection starts to feel like oxygen. That's the paradox of avoidant love. They're torn between the need for independence and the longing for safety. You see, for an avoidant, familiarity is everything. It's their emotional anchor in a world that often feels unpredictable and overwhelming. When they leave a relationship, they might believe they're stepping into freedom. But what they often step into instead is disorientation. New connections feel like uncharted territory. Every interaction demands emotional exposure, and exposure to an avoidant feels like danger. So while they tell themselves they're happier alone, there's a quiet pull toward what they already know, the voice, the presence, the emotional rhythm of the person they left behind. That pull isn't necessarily about love in the romantic sense, though it can include it. It's about familiar safety. It's about the body and mind remembering where they once felt regulated, understood, or at least known. To the avoidant nervous system, that familiarity becomes a kind of emotional home base. No matter how much time passes, that bond retains a trace of comfort. Even if the relationship was turbulent, even if it ended painfully, there's still something grounding about it, because it's known. And in psychology, we know that the brain is drawn to what's known, even when it's not necessarily good for us. Think about it this way: avoidants crave control, but control isn't the same as peace. Peace is internal stability. And they often find that, however briefly, with the person who once saw through their walls. When they pull away, they believe that peace will come from solitude. But solitude doesn't erase attachment, it only amplifies what's unresolved. Over time, the space they created to breathe becomes the same space that makes them feel lost. And when that happens, their mind starts wandering back. They'll think about the small things first. The familiar laugh, the shared jokes, the predictable patterns of comfort. Those details become emotional breadcrumbs, leading them back to the person who once provided emotional equilibrium. And they'll tell themselves it's curiosity, or closure, or just nostalgia. But underneath, what they're truly seeking is that grounding, the emotional stability that only comes from something deeply familiar. This is why avoidants often reappear in the lives of people they once distanced themselves from. It's not always about reigniting romance. It's about reconnecting with a version of themselves they felt safe expressing with that person. Avoidants don't show their full emotional range easily. So when they do, even once, that memory sticks. They might not be able to replicate that openness elsewhere, and that realization hits them harder than they expect, because new people, no matter how kind, loving, or available, can't immediately offer the same sense of emotional safety. The avoidance mind equates the familiar with the secure, even if that familiarity included tension. But here's where it gets deeper. What they're really drawn to isn't the person alone. It's the feeling of being known. Avoidants spend so much of their emotional life hiding, constructing layers of distance and control. Yet, when someone has seen through that and stayed, it creates an imprint. And once that kind of connection has been experienced, it's hard to replace. So even if they leave, even if they swear they're done, a part of them will always circle back to the emotional familiarity that once felt like safety in disguise. Now, if you've ever been on the other side of this, loving someone avoidant, you know this cycle all too well. They disappear, then return as if no time has passed, and it's confusing because you think if they really cared, why did they leave in the first place? The truth is, care was never the issue. It was capacity. Their nervous system couldn't handle the closeness then, but absence reminds them that distance isn't peace, it's emptiness. And so they return, not necessarily ready to stay, but unable to forget. Because connection, once real, leaves a trace that even avoidance can't erase. Familiarity becomes their compass when they're lost in emotional uncertainty. It's the gravitational pull that draws them back toward what once felt like home, even if that home scared them. For avoidance, love often begins as fear and ends as longing, and somewhere in between, they discover that what they're most afraid of losing is often what grounds them most deeply. That's why they come back. Not because they've changed overnight, but because in the silence, they rediscover what made them feel alive in the first place. What's fascinating about avoidance is that they often think they're running from someone else, when in reality, they're running from themselves. The partner they leave behind becomes more than just a person. They become a mirror, and that mirror reflects back the very parts the avoidant has spent a lifetime trying not to see: vulnerability, need, emotional dependence. Those are the qualities that make intimacy rich and alive. But for an avoidant, they represent exposure, weakness, loss of control. So when a partner mirrors those qualities back at them, it triggers something deep. It's not rejection of you, it's rejection of the version of themselves they can't yet accept. This is where the mirror effect becomes powerful and painful. In every relationship, we don't just see the other person, we see ourselves through them. But for avoidance, that reflection feels unbearable. You might show them what true connection looks like: consistent affection, emotional openness, vulnerability. And while a part of them is drawn to it, another part panics. Because deep down, it reminds them of what they fear most: the possibility of being seen and still not being enough. So they retreat. They create emotional distance, not because they've lost interest, but because the relationship has become too revealing. You're holding up a mirror to their unresolved wounds, and in that reflection, they see the child who was shamed for needing love, or the teenager who learned that closeness comes with consequences. Every time you offer intimacy, they're reminded of that old narrative, that to be loved means to risk pain. What's remarkable, though, is that even after they leave, but that mirror doesn't disappear. In fact, it follows them. The reflection lives in their mind, in memories, in moments of quiet, in flashes of what they ran from. Avoidants are haunted by what they've seen in that reflection. Because when someone has truly mirrored them with empathy, acceptance, and patience, it leaves a mark that can't be undone. When they're alone, that mirror starts to resurface internally. The avoidant begins to see the contrast between how they felt with you and how they feel now in isolation. Alone, they don't have to confront the fear of rejection, but they also lose the reflection of warmth, connection, and belonging. And that loss forces a confrontation with self. They start realizing that what they resisted wasn't love itself, but the discomfort of being emotionally visible. They weren't running from you. They were running from the version of themselves that you awakened. This is where their return often begins. Not immediately, not consciously, but subtly. A thought here. A dream there. They start wondering how you're doing. Not because they suddenly became emotionally fluent, but because that mirror is calling them back. It's calling them to finish what they ran from, to face the part of themselves that felt unworthy of love, but was loved anyway. That realization is magnetic. It pulls them back, not just toward you, but toward the possibility of seeing themselves differently. When an avoidant comes back, it's rarely just about missing someone. It's about missing who they were with that person. Because in those moments of closeness, they caught glimpses of a softer, braver self, the one capable of intimacy, of openness, of staying. And while that self frightened them before, it also fascinated them. So when they return, even if they don't have the words for it, they're often seeking reconnection with that lost reflection. But here's the truth, that most people miss relationships with avoidance are not only about love, they're about awakening. They push both people to face their shadows. For the avoidant, it's the shadow of vulnerability. For the partner, it's the shadow of self-worth. And when both people understand that the discomfort they feel isn't a sign of failure, but a sign of growth, everything changes. Because mirrors don't just show what's broken, they show what's possible. Now, does every avoidant come back ready to stay? No. Some come back only to test the reflection again, to see if it still feels safe, if they can face what they couldn't before. Others come back because the lesson they ran from keeps echoing unresolved. But whether they stay or not, the encounter transforms them. You can't unsee yourself once you've been seen by someone who loved you through your defenses. And that's the deeper message here. You were not just another chapter in their story. You were the mirror that revealed who they could be beyond avoidance. You showed them the humanity they had buried under logic, independence, and control. And one way or another, that reflection will always call them back. Maybe not to the relationship, but to themselves. Because real growth begins the moment we stop running from what our reflection shows us. For avoidance, that moment often starts with you. The one who saw them clearly and loved them anyway. If you've ever loved someone with an avoidant attachment style, you've probably noticed the same pattern playing out again and again. Closeness, retreat, return, repeat. It feels like they're stuck in a loop they can't quite escape. And the truth is, they are. Avoidants live in a cycle that constantly recreates the very thing they fear most: emotional dependence. They want connection, they need connection, but the second it begins to feel too real, too intimate, their internal alarm goes off. And instead of facing that discomfort, they pull away, convincing themselves that distance equals safety, that solitude means strength. But the irony is, every time they try to escape connection, they end up reinforcing their attachment to it. It's like emotional gravity. The harder they push away, the stronger the pull becomes over time. That's the essence of the avoidant loop. They're not really running from love. They're running from the loss of control that love exposes. When someone gets close enough to touch those deeper layers of fear, the avoidant instinctively withdraws. They tell themselves they're reclaiming their space, their independence, their clarity. But that withdrawal doesn't bring clarity, it brings confusion. It triggers a different kind of dependence, one built on absence. Because while they're trying to escape attachment, they can't escape the imprint of connection. That imprint becomes a powerful psychological loop. The mind keeps returning to what's unresolved, but the memory of intimacy, of comfort, of emotional recognition, it lingers. And when they isolate, that silence becomes unbearable. It's not peace, it's deprivation. The avoidant begins to crave the very bond they tried to dissolve. They start thinking about the person they left behind, not because they're fickle, but because emotional avoidance doesn't erase longing. It multiplies it in the background. Most avoidants don't realize they're replaying the same pattern over and over. They think each time is different. A new situation, a new reason, a new justification. But underneath, it's the same unfinished story. The same need for love battling the same fear of loss. It's the same subconscious script that says, if I get too close, I'll lose myself. But what they don't see is that every time they disconnect, they lose themselves a little more. Because disconnection doesn't preserve identity, it fractures it. It creates emotional fragments that can't fully integrate because they've never been allowed to exist in the same space as intimacy. This is why the avoidant cycle is so powerful. It's not just behavioral, it's neurological. Every time they repeat it, get close, pull away, feel relief, then emptiness. They're reinforcing the brain's wiring that associates closeness with danger and distance with safety. But the human psyche wasn't designed to thrive in isolation. So after a while, the brain starts sending signals of longing, of nostalgia, of unfinished business. That's when avoidants start circling back. They remember the calm in your voice, the familiarity of your presence, the way connection once felt before fear hijacked it. They come back, not always ready to stay, but because something inside them is trying to resolve the loop. And if you look deeper, that looping isn't about indecision, it's about survival. For the avoidant, this push-pull dynamic is their nervous system's attempt to manage fear and desire at the same time. When they're close, they fear losing autonomy. When they're distant, they fear losing love. And so they live in the tension between the two, never fully in, never fully out, always searching for balance, but mistaking safety for emotional control. It's exhausting for them and for the person who loves them. But here's the thing, awareness can break the loop. When the avoidant starts recognizing that their withdrawal doesn't protect them, but isolates them, that realization becomes the first crack in the pattern. Growth begins when they understand that love isn't the threat. Fear is. Connection doesn't take away freedom, it requires it. Because true autonomy isn't about being alone, it's about being able to stay connected without disappearing into someone else. For the person on the other side of this pattern, the key is to stop chasing the avoidant through the loop. Every time you do, you reinforce their fear that connection means pressure. The more you hold space, rather than force closeness, the more you allow the avoidant to experience what real safety feels like. Safety without suffocation, intimacy without control. And over time, that new emotional experience can rewire the pattern that's been repeating for years. Avoidants always come back because deep down, the loop isn't finished. The story is incomplete. Their mind keeps reaching for what their fear interrupted. They come back seeking what they never allowed themselves to fully experience: emotional peace within connection. But until they face that fear head on, the cycle continues: closeness, retreat, longing, return. And here's the most powerful truth in all of this. The loop isn't just a trap, it's an invitation. It's life's way of calling them to evolve, to stop running, to stop repeating, and to start integrating what they've always divided: love and freedom. Because real connection doesn't ask you to lose yourself. It asks you to find yourself in the presence of another. There's something almost poetic about the way avoidants always find their way back. Not necessarily to the same relationship, but to the same emotional space they once tried to escape. It's not random, and it's not purely nostalgia. It's because unfinished stories have gravity. They pull at the psyche, quietly demanding resolution. Avoidants don't like open endings, not because they crave closure in the traditional sense, but because incompleteness disrupts their illusion of control. They spend so much of their emotional lives trying to maintain distance, trying to appear unaffected, that when something feels unresolved, it challenges the very identity they've built around being detached. In the beginning, leaving feels powerful. It feels decisive, clean, mature, even. They tell themselves it's better this way. Fewer complications, no emotional mess. But time has a way of testing that story. Because when a connection has depth, it leaves echoes. The silence that once felt peaceful starts to hum with unfinished emotion. The avoidant mind starts to wander. What if I overreacted? What if they've moved on? What if I was wrong about them? Those questions are not about the other person. They're about the self. They reveal an internal tug of war between pride and longing, between fear and regret. Avoidants come back because the story between you and them doesn't end neatly. Something about it feels open, raw, incomplete. And that incompleteness gnaws at them, even if they pretend it doesn't. The human brain craves narrative closure. We need things to make sense. We need to know how the story ends. But avoidants rarely allow themselves to experience that in real time. They leave before the emotional arc is complete. They shut down before the truth of the connection can reveal itself. And because they never stay long enough to understand what they're actually feeling, but the unresolved emotion keeps looping back, calling them to return. You see, when you run from something unfinished, you don't escape it. You carry it. It follows you into new relationships, into solitude, into every quiet moment where your guard is down. That's why avoidants can go months or even years appearing fine, only to suddenly think about someone they haven't spoken to in ages. It's not just missing the person. It's their subconscious asking for resolution. There's a psychological need to tie up loose ends, especially when the emotional truth was never faced directly. And for avoidants, that emotional truth is always about vulnerability. It's about what they couldn't say, what they couldn't feel, what they didn't let themselves need. Their silence was supposed to protect them, but eventually, it starts to isolate them. The quiet becomes heavy. They begin to wonder what's happening on the other side of that silence. if the person they left has healed, moved on, stopped caring. And that curiosity is powerful because beneath it lies a deeper question. Am I still seen? Am I still remembered? Avoidants long to be understood without having to reveal themselves. They want to be loved, but safely from a distance. And when that distance becomes too vast, it transforms from safety into loss. That's when they start retracing emotional steps. They'll scroll through old photos, replay old conversations, revisit moments they barely allowed themselves to feel the first time. And in doing so, they start to experience the emotional depth they avoided before. That's why so many of them come back. Not because they've changed overnight, but because they're finally starting to feel what they once suppressed. The story they cut short begins to demand completion, not just with the other person, but within themselves. But there's something even more profound here. The return of the avoidant isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about reckoning. They're confronting the parts of themselves they abandoned along the way. They're realizing that avoidance didn't make them strong, it made them lonely. That distance didn't create clarity, it created longing. And when they come back, what they're really trying to find isn't just connection, it's self-forgiveness. Because on some level, they know they didn't just walk away from someone else. They walked away from who they were capable of being in that relationship. That's what makes the unfinished story so powerful. It's not just emotional nostalgia, it's the psyche seeking integration. Avoidants are often caught between two selves, the one that wants to love and the one that fears love. When they come back, it's those two selves trying to meet, to coexist, to find peace in the same space. The relationship becomes a mirror once again, reflecting both who they were and who they could become if they stopped running. For anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of that return, it's important to understand their coming back isn't always about you. Sometimes it's about them finally confronting what they couldn't face before. And whether that leads to reconciliation or closure, it's still progress. Because every time an avoidant comes back, they're taking one small step closer to wholeness, to completing the emotional circle they've been afraid to finish their whole life. And for the avoidant, that's the invitation, to stop leaving stories unfinished, to stay long enough to feel what's uncomfortable, to realize that closure doesn't come from control, it comes from courage.